I'm not ashamed.
What did Pharaoh do after his firstborn son was struck dead? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Exodus on Walking Through the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Exodus chapter 12. We're going to be reading from verses 29 to 36. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Exodus chapter 12, beginning at verse 29. And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he, all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. In chapter 11, Moses stood before Pharaoh and pronounced what the final plague that God would inflict upon Egypt would be, the death of the firstborn son. After leaving Pharaoh, we get Moses' instructions to Israel concerning two feasts that would commemorate this time of year. The Passover, remembering how God passed over their houses and spared them while smiting the Egyptian households, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which reminded them of the actual deliverance from Egypt by God. We'll see those regulations again stated further in this chapter and in chapter 13, so we'll leave further comments until then. So it was at midnight, after the children of Israel had killed the Passover lamb, spread its blood on the doorpost and lintel, and ate the lamb, that the Lord struck all the firstborn sons in the land of Egypt. How did the Lord do this? Well, in the previous 9 plagues, God used natural means in a supernatural way. He used real locusts, even though the swarms were miraculous. He used real hail, even though their size was miraculous. He used real frogs, even though their numbers were miraculous. The same could be said of the other plagues as well. However, there is a big difference between this plague and the other 9. In the first 9 plagues, Moses raised his staff, and the Lord brought forth the plague. Not so in this case. Moses did not raise his staff. For all we know, he was asleep in bed at this point. No, this miracle was done without the call of Moses. Therefore, it could only be said that the Lord had done this. How did he strike down the firstborn? He could have done it any number of ways, but from the language of the chapter, he simply spoke the words and the firstborn died. God doesn't need to use pestilence or accidents to cause our death. He could just speak it and it be so. We also learn from the language that it is quite possible that the firstborn who was struck down were the firstborn of the families that had not yet become fathers, in other words, children. The reason we conclude this is because Pharaoh wasn't killed here, only his firstborn son was. Now, even though it is possible that Pharaoh wasn't the firstborn, it is more likely that he was. Now, I won't be dogmatic on this point, but the language appears to me that God struck down the firstborn male child of the family, rather than those who were firstborn adults. Nobody in Egypt was spared this plague, not even the livestock. However, we know that Israel was spared because God passed over their houses. There was a great cry in Egypt, the likes of which had never been heard before. Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron that very night. He didn't wait until the morning like he did with the frogs. He told them to take all of Israel, including all of the cattle, and leave Egypt to worship God. The loss of his firstborn son had finally cut through Pharaoh's hardness of heart, for the moment that is, to which he agreed to let Israel go. Had God not used the other 9 plagues first, it is quite possible that Pharaoh wouldn't even relented here. But God knew what he was doing. He gradually increased the intensity of the plagues so that this last one would finally cause Pharaoh to relent. I find it funny that Pharaoh asked Moses that the Lord bless him also. However, I don't believe Pharaoh said this out of a desire to worship God, but out of a desire for God to stop inflicting him. Along with Pharaoh, the Egyptians also urged Israel to leave, for they had had enough of the plagues. They said if Israel didn't leave, surely they would all be dead. So Israel left quickly, in the middle of the night, with all their possessions and their animals. The dough that they would have had for making bread had yet to be leavened, so they fled with that dough, hence the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They also had obeyed the word of the Lord and asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing, and received these things. So despite their slavery, they left Egypt the way their ancestors had arrived, very wealthy. We'll continue with this story, the Lord willing, in the next episode. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Exodus chapter 12, verses 37 to 42, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
I'm not ashamed.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his cross.